The encounter. Officer Mark Reed pushed open the door of the Copper Kettle Café, the familiar chime ringing softly above him as he stepped inside. It was the end of a long day, and he was ready to unwind. This little corner cafe had become his favorite spot over the years, a place where he could briefly escape the stress of his job and find solace in the comfort of his routine. Tonight, however, he had an extra reason to celebrate: his wedding anniversary. Mark had planned to grab a quick drink, then head home to Julia, his wife, who had spent the day preparing a special dinner for their evening together. He took his usual seat in the back corner, his eyes sweeping over the cozy interior of the cafe. The dim, warm lighting cast a gentle glow over the rustic decor. Vintage copper kettles hung on the walls, and sepia-toned photos of Ridgway's past adorned the spaces between. The worn leather booths and the steady murmur of conversation created an atmosphere that felt timeless, as if the world outside had paused for just a moment. Settling into his seat, Mark pulled out his phone, smiling as he read Julia's message. "Don't forget dinner at 8:00 p.m., love you." He replied quickly, letting her know he'd be home soon. Then he ordered a beer from the waitress, intending to relax for a few minutes before heading out. As he sipped his drink, he let his mind drift, replaying the events of the day. It had been unusually taxing. Domestic disputes, fender benders, and a particularly heated altercation at a local store that had taken all his patience to de-escalate. Tonight, he needed this brief respite, a few quiet moments to himself before rejoining the world outside. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Out of the corner of his eye, Mark noticed a figure standing outside the cafe, lingering by the window. At first, he paid little attention, assuming it was just another passerby. But something about the way the person stood, still and almost spectral in the evening gloom, caught his attention. Squinting through the glass, he realized it was an elderly woman, dressed in what appeared to be a faded hospital gown, her frame thin and frail against the backdrop of Ridgway's darkening streets. Mark's instincts prickled. The woman looked out of place, her gown more suited for a hospital ward than the chilly street outside. Her posture was unsettling. She swayed slightly, her eyes cast downward, as if struggling with an invisible weight. Despite his initial urge to ignore it, he was, after all, off duty. Mark found himself unable to look away. Before he could decide what to do, the woman turned and walked toward the cafe door, pushing it open with a trembling hand. The warmth of the cafe lighting highlighted her features as she stepped inside. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, set deep in a gaunt face, held a distant, haunted look. Mark watched as she scanned the room, her gaze unfocused yet oddly determined, like someone searching for a specific face in a crowd. Her frail hand clutched the fabric of her gown, her fingers trembling as they twisted the worn material. She seemed lost, adrift in a world that had moved on without her. As she walked further into the cafe, Mark noticed how the other patrons shifted uncomfortably, some casting curious glances while others turned away, eager to avoid whatever trouble she might bring. But the woman didn't stop until she reached his booth, her eyes finally locking onto his with a startling intensity. "Excuse me, ma'am," Mark began, his tone gentle but firm. "Do you need help? Are you lost?" The woman blinked, her eyes briefly clearing as if she was only now realizing she was in a public place. She hesitated, glancing around nervously, before leaning in close to Mark. Her voice, when it came, was a raspy whisper, her words barely audible over the hum of the cafe. They should have let it end, but they didn't. And now, he's waiting. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Her words were cryptic, laden with an urgency that made his instincts flare. He leaned in closer, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Was she in danger? Was someone else? He studied her face, trying to read her expression, but her eyes had taken on that distant look again, as though she were trapped in some invisible nightmare. "Who's waiting?" Mark asked, keeping his voice low and steady. "Is someone threatening you?" The woman shook her head, her frail body trembling with the effort. "Not me. It's too late for that," she murmured, her voice fading. "But it's my fault. I should have stopped him." Mark's hand instinctively went to his phone. He was off duty, but he could call for backup if needed. The words "I should have stopped him" echoed in his mind, sending alarm bells ringing. He didn't know if this woman was in immediate danger or if her mind was simply clouded by confusion and trauma. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He glanced around the café, hoping one of the other patrons might step in, but everyone was deliberately avoiding their gaze, focused on their coffee cups and quiet conversations. It was just him, this mysterious woman, and her unsettling words. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm Officer Mark Reed. I can help you, but I need to understand what's going on. Do you have family nearby? Is there someone I can call for you?" The woman blinked slowly, as if processing his words. Then, to his surprise, she reached out, her cold, bony fingers gripping his hand with surprising strength. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, he saw a glimmer of clarity, a flicker of the person she must have once been. "They'll come, tonight," she whispered, "to finish what they started." Mark's heart pounded as he tried to make sense of her cryptic warnings. Who was they? What did they want? The urgency in her voice was unmistakable, and the fear in her eyes sent a shiver through him. "Please, Mom," he said, leaning in closer, "tell me who they are. Who's coming tonight?" But before she could answer, the clarity faded from her gaze, replaced by a vacant stare. She released his hand, her fingers going limp as she stepped back, murmuring to herself in a language he couldn't understand. It was as if the brief moment of lucidity had drained her completely. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the café, her fragile form swaying slightly as she disappeared into the darkness outside. Mark sat frozen in his booth, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to follow her, to make sure she was safe. But he was off duty, and he had plans. Julia was waiting for him, dinner ready, the anniversary celebration she'd worked so hard to prepare. He could hear his own voice in his mind, reminding him to let it go. But then he remembered the fear in the woman's eyes, the tremor in her voice as she spoke of someone waiting, of something left unfinished. Reluctantly, Mark pulled out his phone, typing a quick message to Julia. "Something's come up. I might be a little late. I'll explain everything later. Love you." He hit send, knowing she would understand. Julia knew him better than anyone, knew that when he sensed something was wrong, he couldn't just walk away. Taking a deep breath, he stood, leaving his half-finished beer on the table as he made his way to the door. Stepping outside, he scanned the darkened street, searching for any sign of the woman. She was nowhere to be seen, the empty sidewalk stretching out before him like a stage set for an unseen drama. But he knew she couldn't have gone far. He set off in the direction he'd seen her take, his senses on high alert, his mind running through possibilities. As he walked, the quiet of Ridgeway's streets felt heavy, oppressive. The small town, usually peaceful and welcoming, seemed to hold its breath, as if it too were waiting for something to unfold. Mark knew he was stepping into the unknown, and he had no idea what he would find at the end of this strange journey. But one thing was certain: he couldn't ignore the plea in that woman's eyes, the silent call for help that had reached through her confusion and touched something deep within him. He continued down the street, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone to call for backup if needed, the soft echoes of his footsteps, the only sound in the darkness. Whatever lay ahead, he was determined to find the answers she hadn't been able to give him, and to face whatever danger might come his way. Into the shadows, Mark moved down the darkened sidewalk, his steps cautious, his senses heightened. He had no idea where the woman had gone, but he had a strong hunch that she wouldn't have wandered far. The streets of Ridgeway were quiet, almost eerily so, and each sound seemed to echo in the stillness. Streetlights cast long shadows, turning familiar buildings into looming shapes, and the once welcoming town felt like a place of secrets. He walked a few blocks, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of her, but the streets were empty. As he approached an intersection, he spotted a flicker of movement down a narrow alleyway, a frail figure moving slowly, barely visible in the shadows. Mark's heart quickened. It was her. He turned into the alley, careful to keep his distance. She moved with a strange, slow purpose, her hospital gown billowing slightly in the night breeze. Mark took note of her fragile, unsteady gait and the way she occasionally looked over her shoulder, as if haunted by something unseen. The tension in her movements was unmistakable. She was afraid. As he followed her deeper into the alley, a strange thought crossed his mind. What could have driven her to wander the streets at this hour, in that condition, speaking in cryptic phrases? He had seen people in distress before, people driven by grief or confusion. But this felt different. There was an urgency to her words that he couldn't shake. The alley was dimly lit, the weak glow of distant streetlights casting eerie shadows. The sounds of the town faded as they moved further away from the main road, and Mark could feel his pulse quickening. He knew he should call for backup, but something in him resisted. This was a quiet town, and he was just following an elderly woman. What threat could she possibly pose? But as he watched her, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled with unease. The woman reached the end of the alley and turned into an abandoned lot, bordered by rusted chain-link fencing and overgrown weeds. Mark slowed his pace, observing her carefully. She stopped in the middle of the lot, her body visibly trembling as she scanned her surroundings, her gaze flickering with a strange, haunted intensity. Her lips moved, and Mark strained to hear her words, but the distance muffled them. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, calling out to her, "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" She didn't respond, didn't even look his way. It was as if she couldn't hear him. Instead, she reached out with one thin, bony hand and placed it on a nearby fence post, her fingers gripping the rusted metal tightly, knuckles white. She muttered something again, her voice low and desperate, and Mark finally caught a few words. "It's too late, too late. I should have stopped them." Mark's mind raced as he pieced together what little he knew. Was she talking about a family tragedy? An accident? He approached her slowly, careful not to startle her. He was close enough now to see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of something unseen. "Ma'am, my name is Officer Reed," he said gently, his tone soft but firm. "You're not in any trouble, but I need to know if you're safe. Is there someone I can call for you? Family? Friends?" At the sound of his voice, she turned slowly to face him, her gaze unfocused, but filled with a sadness so profound it made his chest ache. For a brief moment, her eyes locked onto his, and he saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of awareness that seemed to cut through the fog of her confusion. "They were supposed to end it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But they didn't. And now he's still here." Mark's skin prickled with unease. "Who's still here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you talking about someone you know? Are they in danger?" She took a shuddering breath, her gaze drifting back to the fence post, as if it held answers he couldn't see. "I tried to tell them, but they wouldn't listen. They never listen." Her voice broke, and she seemed to shrink in on herself, her shoulders hunching as if weighed down by an unbearable burden. Now it's too late. It's all too late. Mark felt a pang of helplessness. He wanted to help her, to understand what had brought her to this state. But her words were like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. He was off duty, unarmed, with no radio to call for immediate assistance. His phone was in his pocket, but he didn't want to risk breaking the fragile connection he had with her by turning away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with quiet urgency, "please let me help you. If there's someone you're worried about, I can call for assistance. Just tell me what's happening." For a moment, it seemed as though she might answer him, her lips parting slightly as she looked up at him with haunted eyes. But then, as quickly as the moment had come, it vanished. Her gaze grew distant, her expression empty. She turned away from him, muttering to herself in a language he didn't understand. Mark was about to reach for his phone when she suddenly began walking again, moving further into the lot and toward an old, dilapidated building that stood at the far end. The building looked like it hadn't been used in years. Windows boarded up, walls covered in graffiti, and weeds growing unchecked around its foundation. Mark hesitated, a chill running down his spine. He knew he shouldn't follow her into the building, knew that every instinct as a cop and as a person was telling him to call for backup, to bring this situation under control. But he couldn't shake the feeling that if he left her alone, something terrible would happen. Taking a deep breath, he followed her. The door to the building was slightly ajar, and Mark slipped inside, careful to make as little noise as possible. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the empty rooms. He could barely see in the dim light, but he kept his focus on the faint shuffling sounds ahead of him, guiding him deeper into the building. The woman moved with a strange, eerie purpose, her steps unsteady yet determined. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, weaving through the darkened corridors with a familiarity that made Mark's stomach tighten with unease. They reached a small, dimly lit room at the back of the building. The walls were lined with old, rusted machinery, and the floor was littered with broken pieces of equipment. The woman stopped in the center of the room, her back to him, her hands clasped tightly together. Mark stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Ma'am, what's going on? Why did you bring me here?" She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a haunting clarity he hadn't seen before. "They left him here," she said, her voice a trembling whisper. "All these years, they left him here, and now, he won't rest." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He tried to maintain his composure, but his mind raced with questions. Was she talking about someone who had died here? Had someone been abandoned, forgotten? "Who's he?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Is there someone here who needs help?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she moved to a corner of the room, crouching down beside an old rusted metal box. She reached out, her fingers brushing over the surface of the box with a reverence that sent a chill through him. Then she looked up at him, her gaze piercing. "They told me he was gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can still hear him. Every night, I hear him calling, asking why I left him." Mark's heart ached at the pain in her voice, the desperation that laced every word. He took a step closer, his instincts screaming at him to get to the bottom of this, to understand what had happened to her. "Ma'am, please," he said, his tone gentle. "I want to help. Just tell me what happened here." The woman stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull him in, to make him feel the weight of her grief. And then, finally, she spoke. "He was my son," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He was my little boy, and they told me he was gone, but he wasn't. They left him here, all alone." Mark felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as her words sank in. A dozen questions flooded his mind, each one more disturbing than the last. Had her son really been left behind, abandoned in this decaying building? And if so, what had happened to him? Before he could ask, the woman's gaze drifted away, her expression distant once more. She seemed to shrink in on herself, her shoulders hunching as if under an unbearable weight. She whispered something under her breath, too soft for him to hear, and then she turned and began to walk toward the door. Mark took a shaky breath, his mind reeling. He knew he couldn't leave her alone, couldn't walk away from this. He had to find out the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. Reaching for his phone, he quickly dialed for backup, his voice steady as he relayed his location and the situation. The dispatcher's response was quick, assuring him that assistance was on the way. As he ended the call, he looked back at the woman, who was now standing by the door, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow from outside. Her shoulders were slumped, her head bowed, and she looked so small, so broken. Mark felt a surge of determination, Whatever had happened here, whatever secrets this place held, he would find out. He owed it to her son, and to himself. As he walked toward her, ready to face whatever lay ahead, he knew this was only the beginning of a long, dark journey. Echoes of the past. As Officer Mark Reed stood in the doorway of the decrepit building, his breath hung in the cold, stale air. The dim light from his phone cast eerie shadows across the walls, illuminating remnants of a life long forgotten. Broken chairs, peeling wallpaper, and scattered remnants of toys and clothes, all covered in a layer of dust. Mark's pulse quickened, a heavy sense of dread settling over him as he glanced at the frail figure of the elderly woman standing beside him. She looked even smaller now, her bony shoulders hunched, her face hidden beneath wisps of thinning gray hair. There was something haunting in her silence, a lingering sorrow that spoke of years of regret and pain. Mark felt the weight of her words pressing down on him, the cryptic mention of her son, the accusation of abandonment, and the raw anguish in her voice. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice barely breaking the silence. "Please, I need to understand. You said your son was left here. What happened?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on a darkened corner of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if bracing herself for a truth too painful to bear. Finally, she took a shuddering breath and looked up at him, her eyes filled with a deep, haunting sadness. "They told me he was dead," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They said he was gone, that he'd been taken from me. But I knew, deep down, I knew he was still here, waiting, alone." Mark's heart tightened as her words sank in. He'd dealt with tragedy before, accidents, domestic disputes, even violence, but this was different. This was the kind of sorrow that didn't fade with time, the kind of pain that lingered, festering in the quiet corners of the soul. He took a step closer, his voice soft but steady. "Ma'am, if your son was left here, if you believe he's still here, I need to know what happened. Maybe I can help." The woman's gaze drifted back to the corner, her expression unreadable. "It was a long time ago," she said, her voice barely audible. "We lived here, in this building. It was different then, bright and warm, filled with laughter. My little boy used to play in these rooms, his laughter echoing down the hallways. He was my world." Mark could hear the pain in her voice, the way each word seemed to drag up memories she'd long buried. He waited, giving her the time she needed to continue. "But then he got sick," she whispered, her voice breaking. "A fever that wouldn't go away. We didn't have money, didn't have insurance. I took him to the hospital, begged them to help him. They said they'd take care of him, but they lied." Mark's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger and bitterness in her voice, the raw wound that hadn't healed in all these years. "They said he was gone," she continued, her eyes filling with tears. "They told me he'd died. They gave me his things, his little shoes, his favorite toy, and they sent me home. I was too broken to question them, too lost in my grief. But then, I started hearing him." She paused, her hands shaking as she clasped them together. "At night, I'd hear his voice, calling for me. I thought I was losing my mind. People told me it was just grief, that I was imagining things. But I knew he was still here, waiting for me." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard of grief causing hallucinations, of people hearing voices or seeing visions of loved ones they'd lost. But this felt different. There was a certainty in her voice, a conviction that made him question everything he thought he knew. "Did you ever come back here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you try to find him?" The woman shook her head, her gaze filled with shame. "I was afraid," she whispered, "afraid of what I'd find, or what I wouldn't. I tried to move on, to forget, but I couldn't. The guilt ate away at me, day after day, year after year. I abandoned him, left him here, alone. And now, he won't let me rest." Mark's heart ached as he listened to her story. He could see the toll it had taken on her, the way her body seemed to sag under the weight of her guilt. He didn't know if her son was truly here, or if her mind had created a prison of grief and regret. But one thing was clear: she needed closure. She needed to face whatever had been haunting her all these years. "Come on," he said gently, reaching out to her. "Let's take a look around. Maybe we'll find something that can give you peace." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with fear, but finally nodded. Together, they walked further into the building, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath them. They reached an old staircase, the wood splintered and worn from years of neglect. The woman stopped at the base of the stairs, her gaze fixed on the steps as if they held a secret she wasn't ready to face. "He used to play up there," she whispered, her voice filled with longing. "He loved to climb those stairs, to hide in the little room at the top. It was his special place, his little kingdom." Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let's go," he said softly. "I'll be right here with you." She nodded, her steps hesitant as they began to climb. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step feeling like a journey back in time. Mark could feel the tension radiating from her, the way her body trembled with every movement. As they reached the top of the stairs, they found themselves in a small hallway, lined with doors that led to forgotten rooms. The woman stopped outside a door at the end of the hall, her hand hovering over the doorknob as if afraid to touch it. "This was his room," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This was where they said he." Mark's heart pounded as he watched her, sensing the depth of her pain. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but he knew words wouldn't be enough. This was a wound that only the truth could heal. Slowly, she opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was small and empty, the walls bare except for faint marks where pictures had once hung. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The woman stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of longing and sorrow. She walked to the corner, where a small broken toy lay on the floor, a faded stuffed bear, its fur matted and torn. She picked it up, cradling it in her hands, her shoulders shaking as silent tears fell down her cheeks. Mark felt a lump form in his throat, a sense of helplessness as he watched her confront the memories she tried to bury. But then, something strange happened. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. Mark shivered, glancing around as a sense of unease settled over him. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. The woman's eyes widened, her gaze fixed on the doorway. Her lips parted, and a single word escaped in a trembling whisper. "Even." Mark turned, his heart pounding as he followed her gaze. But there was nothing there, just the empty doorway, the darkness of the hallway beyond. He took a step forward, straining to see, but the shadows seemed to thicken, pressing in around them. "Did you see something?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, her eyes filling with fear and wonder. "He's here," she whispered. "I can feel him. He's waiting, just like he always was." Mark's skin prickled as he felt the weight of her words. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in the supernatural. But there was something about this place, about her story, that made him question everything he thought he knew. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Ma'am, I know this is difficult, but if there's anything here, anything that can help you find peace, we'll find it." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and desperation. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not leaving me, for helping me face this." Mark nodded, his resolve strengthening. He didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if they would find answers or only more questions, but he was determined to see this through, to help her find the closure she so desperately needed. They spent the next hour searching the building, moving from room to room, examining every corner and crevice. Mark's mind raced with possibilities, his instincts on high alert, as he pieced together the fragments of her story. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on them, the echoes of a tragedy that had never been fully laid to rest. And then, in the back of a closet in the small bedroom, he found it, a box, dusty and forgotten, hidden behind a pile of old newspapers. He opened it carefully, his breath catching as he saw what lay inside. A collection of toys, a faded photograph of a young boy with bright eyes and a mischievous smile, and a hospital bracelet with the name Even Hawthorne. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he held the items, sensing the weight of the years, the pain and loss that had been hidden away for so long. He turned to the woman, showing her the items, and watched as her face crumpled, her body shaking with sobs. "It's him," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's my boy, my little Even." Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support as she finally confronted the truth she had spent a lifetime running from. And as the weight of her grief poured out, filling the empty room, he knew that this was only the beginning of the healing process for both of them. They stood together in the darkness, united by a shared understanding of pain and loss, and for the first time, Mark felt a sense of purpose beyond the badge he wore. He had been called here, to this place, to help a broken soul find peace. But as he looked around the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that the shadows held secrets yet to be revealed, and that this journey was far from over. The forgotten truth. Officer Mark Reed stood silently in the dim room, holding the faded photograph of a boy named Even Hawthorne. The image was hauntingly innocent, a young boy with sparkling eyes and a carefree smile, unaware of the fate that awaited him. The old woman, Laura, sat slumped on the floor beside him, clutching the hospital bracelet and the small, worn-out teddy bear from the box. Her frail hands trembled as she held onto these fragments of her son's past, tears streaming silently down her weathered cheeks. Mark's heart ached as he watched her. There was a deep sadness in the air, an intangible sorrow that seeped from every corner of this abandoned room. He'd seen grief before, but this was different. This was a lifetime of pain, of unanswered questions, of a mother who'd lived in the shadow of her son's absence. And now, here she was, confronted with the remnants of a truth she'd long buried. "Even," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My sweet boy. They told me you were gone." Mark kneeled beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Laura," he said softly, "you mentioned that someone told you Even had passed away, that the hospital said he was gone. Can you tell me more about what happened?" Laura looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. "They took him," she murmured. "He was so sick, burning up with fever. I was desperate. I begged them to help him, but we didn't have any money, no insurance. They looked at me like I was trash, like we didn't deserve their help. But they finally agreed, said they would take care of him." She paused, her gaze drifting back to the bracelet in her hand. "They told me I couldn't stay, said they needed to keep him for observation. I didn't want to leave him, but they insisted. They promised they'd call if anything happened. I went home, spent the night praying, waiting for news. And then, the next morning, they told me he was gone." Mark's fists clenched involuntarily as he listened. He could sense the pain in her voice, the years of unresolved grief, the anger that had simmered beneath the surface all this time. He knew the limitations of the healthcare system, the way people without money or insurance were often neglected. But this felt wrong on a level he couldn't quite grasp. "Did they give you any explanation?" he asked carefully, trying to keep his tone steady. "Did they let you see him?" She shook her head, a fresh wave of tears streaming down her face. "No. They just handed me his things, said he was gone, and that was it. No answers, no closure. They told me it was best to let it go, to move on. I tried to believe them, tried to accept it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then, not long after, I started hearing him. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The rational part of him wanted to attribute her experiences to grief, to the unbearable weight of losing a child without closure. But another part, the part that had felt the cold, eerie presence in this room, wondered if there was more to it than that. "Laura," he said gently, "you said you heard even. What did you hear exactly?" She looked at him, her eyes hollow with a mixture of fear and hope. At first, it was just whispers. Little sounds in the night, like he was calling for me. I thought I was losing my mind. But then it became clearer. I hear him crying, saying he was scared, that he wanted to come home. It got so bad that I came back here, thinking I'd find him. I searched every room, every corner of this building, but there was nothing. Nothing but emptiness. Mark nodded, absorbing her words. He'd heard of cases where people claimed to experience the voices or presence of loved ones who'd passed. Often, it was a coping mechanism, the mind's way of filling the void left by loss. But the desperation in Laura's voice, the rawness of her pain, made him hesitate to dismiss her experiences so easily. "Laura," he said softly, "do you believe that he's still here in some way?" She nodded slowly, her face pale and drawn. "I don't know if it's his spirit or if it's just a part of him left behind. But I know he never left this place. I feel him, Officer Reed. I feel him in every creak, every whisper. He's here, waiting for me to bring him home." Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't know if he believed in spirits or ghosts, but he did believe in unresolved pain, in the way trauma could linger, casting long shadows over the years. And as he looked around the room, at the dust-covered toys, the faded wallpaper, the empty crib pushed against the wall, he felt that shadow pressing in on him. He stood up, glancing around the room once more. "Laura," he said, "do you remember the name of the doctor or the hospital staff who handled Evan's case? Anyone who might have been involved?" She looked up at him, her brow furrowing as she tried to remember. "There was a nurse," she murmured, her voice uncertain. "Her name was Sarah. She was kind, the only one who seemed to care. She told me she'd look after him. But after that night, I never saw her again. It was like she disappeared." Mark felt a spark of curiosity ignite within him. A nurse named Sarah who had promised to look after Evan, but had seemingly vanished. It was a lead, a small one, but it was something. He pulled out his phone, making a quick note to look into the hospital's records, to see if he could find any information on a nurse by that name. "Thank you, Laura," he said, his voice gentle. "You've been incredibly brave to come back here, to face this after all these years. I promise I'll do everything I can to help you find the truth." Laura gave him a faint smile, the first hint of relief he'd seen on her face. "Thank you, Officer Reed. I just want to know what happened to my son. I need to know if he's finally at peace." Mark nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew this was more than just an investigation. It was a journey into the past, a search for answers that had eluded Laura for decades. And as he looked into her haunted eyes, he felt a deep resolve settle within him. He would find the truth, no matter where it led. They left the room together, Mark guiding her gently back down the stairs. Outside, the night had grown colder, the wind whistling through the empty streets as they made their way back toward the main road. The weight of the building, of the secrets it held, seemed to press down on them as they walked, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being washed. As they reached the edge of the lot, Laura stopped, glancing back at the building one last time. "Goodbye, Evan," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "I'm so sorry. I should have come back sooner." Mark placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, sensing the depth of her sorrow. He knew this wasn't the end for her, that the journey to finding peace would be long and difficult. But he also knew that she had taken the first step, that by confronting the darkness of her past, she had begun the process of healing. "I'll be in touch, Laura," he said softly. I'll look into everything you told me. We'll find the truth together." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears once more. "Thank you, Officer Reed. You don't know what this means to me." They parted ways, Laura disappearing into the night as Mark watched her go. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, of purpose as he stood there alone, the weight of the night pressing down on him. But as he turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He glanced back at the building, his heart pounding as he saw a shadow pass by one of the upstairs windows. It was a brief glimpse, a fleeting moment, but he could have sworn he saw the outline of a small figure, a child, standing silently, watching him. Mark blinked, his rational mind struggling to make sense of what he'd just seen. He knew it was impossible, that it was likely a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination. But as he turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that Evan's spirit, or whatever remained of him, was still there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the answers that had been denied to him. As he drove home, Mark's mind was filled with questions. Who was Nurse Sarah? And why had she vanished? Why hadn't the hospital given Laura more information? And most importantly, what had really happened to Evan? Mark resolved to dig deeper, to search the records, to find anyone who had been connected to Evan's case. He knew this was more than just a mystery. It was a quest for justice, for closure, for a mother who had been left with nothing but unanswered questions and the whispers of a lost child. He didn't know what he would find, but one thing was certain. He would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, to bring peace to a soul that had been lost in the darkness for far too long. The search for answers. Officer Mark Reed couldn't shake the image of the small shadow he'd seen in the upstairs window as he walked away from the abandoned building. Every logical part of his mind told him it was just a trick of the light, his eyes playing games on him after a night filled with eerie stories and emotional weight. But another part, a quieter, more instinctual part, felt that something very real was lingering in that building, something tethered to the secrets of Evan Hawthorne's disappearance. The following morning, Mark sat in his office, surrounded by case files and the remnants of an uneaten sandwich, his mind preoccupied with Laura's haunting words and the fragmented story of her lost son. He had stayed up late, replaying their conversation in his mind, unable to shake the sorrow in her voice, the years of grief and guilt that had gnawed at her like an open wound. He promised her answers, but where would he find them? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mark decided to start with the hospital records. It wasn't an easy task. The hospital where Laura had taken Evan had closed down decades ago, its files scattered and many of them lost over the years. But Mark had connections, other officers who knew their way around old records, local archives, and even the labyrinth of bureaucratic paperwork that often swallowed up cases like Evan's. He called his friend and fellow officer, Carl Henson, who had a knack for digging up old records and knew Ridgway's history better than anyone else on the force. Carl was the kind of cop who could tell you the story behind every building in town, who remembered names and faces from long ago, and who could often find information that had been forgotten by time itself. "Carl," Mark said over the phone, his voice low but urgent, "I need a favor. It's a cold case. Real cold, actually. From about 40 years ago. It involves a little boy named Evan Hawthorne. His mother took him to the hospital when he was sick, and they told her he died. But there are some inconsistencies. She believes he was left there, or something worse." Carl was silent for a moment, then sighed. "Mark, you sure you want to dive into this? Old cases like this, especially involving kids, tend to have a lot of loose ends. People don't like them reopened, especially after all this time. But I'll see what I can dig up." Mark thanked him, knowing that Carl would do everything in his power to find those records, no matter how buried they were. In the meantime, Mark decided to visit the town's local archive. It was located in a small, dimly lit building near the courthouse, staffed by a few aging librarians who knew the town's history as well as they knew the alphabet. As he entered the archive, the smell of old paper and dust greeted him, a comforting yet slightly suffocating scent that seemed fitting for a place filled with the weight of history. He approached the front desk, where a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile looked up from her book. "Officer Reed," she greeted him. "What brings you to our little corner of history?" Mark returned her smile, though his own was strained. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to look up some old records, hospital-related, if possible, from about 40 years ago, specifically concerning a young boy named Evan Hawthorne. His mother, Laura, said he was taken in for treatment, but she suspects he may not have been given the care he needed." Mrs. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful frown. "Ah, Ridgeway General," she murmured, shaking her head. "It was a sad chapter in our town's history. They took in a lot of patients but didn't have the resources to give proper care to those who couldn't pay. I'll check our records and see if we have anything on file from that time period." Mark waited as she disappeared into the back room, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. His fingers drummed nervously on the counter as he thought about the hospital, once a beacon of hope, now an empty shell that bore witness to so many tragedies. He wondered how many others like Laura had left those halls with unanswered questions, with the gnawing feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. Finally, Mrs. Thompson returned, carrying a dusty folder labeled Ridgeway General, Pediatric Cases. She handed it to him, her eyes solemn. "There's not much here, Officer Reed. A few names, some dates, but you're welcome to go through it. I hope you find what you're looking for." Mark thanked her and settled at a small table in the corner, flipping open the folder with a sense of anticipation and dread. The records were faded, the ink barely legible in places, but he could make out dates, names, and diagnoses, each entry a small piece of a larger, tragic story. And then his breath caught as he found Evan's name, scribbled in shaky handwriting. Evan Hawthorne. Admitted April 14, 1979. Age: 6. Symptoms: high fever, respiratory distress. The notes were brief, clinical, devoid of empathy. But as Mark read further, he found something that made his blood run cold. Patient transferred to Ward 3, pediatric isolation. Isolation. Mark's brow furrowed. Why would they isolate a child with a fever, especially one who was as sick as Evan had been? The records offered no explanation, no rationale, just a few lines of text that hinted at something dark, something hidden. He flipped the page, searching for more, but Evan's file ended abruptly, with a single line that chilled him to the bone. Patient condition: deceased. Body transferred to morgue. Family notified. But that wasn't what troubled him. It was the line beneath it, hastily scrawled in different handwriting, as if added later. Follow-up. Closed case. No further inquiry. Mark felt a surge of anger and disbelief. No further inquiry. A child had supposedly died, and they hadn't bothered to investigate, to verify. The whole thing felt wrong, like a door that had been slammed shut to keep the truth from escaping. Determined to find out more, Mark returned to the front desk, clutching the file in his hand. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice low, "do you know anything about Ward 3 at Ridgeway General? It says here that Evan was transferred there, to the isolation ward." She looked at him with a strange expression, a mixture of sadness and discomfort. "Ward 3, yes, I remember it. That's where they sent patients who couldn't afford proper care. It was their way of keeping them out of sight, out of mind. People called it the Forgotten Ward. It wasn't officially on any of the hospital's records. It was a dark time, Officer Reed. Those children, many of them didn't make it out." Mark's heart sank. The Forgotten Ward, a place where children like Evan were sent to be hidden away, their fates decided by money, or the lack of it. He could barely comprehend the horror of it, the callousness of those who had allowed it to happen. He thanked Mrs. Thompson and left the archive, his mind racing. He needed to find someone who had worked at the hospital during that time, someone who might know more about what happened to the children in Ward 3. And he had a lead, the nurse Laura had mentioned, the one named Sarah. He spent the next few hours calling local nursing homes and assisted living facilities, hoping to find anyone who might remember Sarah or the events at Ridgeway General. After countless dead ends, he finally got a break. An elderly woman named Sarah Montgomery, who had been a nurse at Ridgeway General, was living at Rosewood Care Home, just outside of town. Without a moment's hesitation, Mark drove to Rosewood, his mind filled with questions. As he walked into the facility, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on him, a sense that he was about to unearth something that had been buried for far too long. A nurse directed him to Sarah's room, a quiet space filled with potted plants and soft sunlight filtering through lace curtains. Sarah was in her late 80s, her face lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and alert as she looked up at him. "Officer Reed," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I understand you want to know about Ridgeway General. About the children in Ward 3. Mark nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, ma'am. I'm investigating the case of Evan Hawthorne. His mother believes he was left there, that he didn't die, as they told her." Sarah's face softened, a shadow of sorrow passing over her eyes. "Evan, yes, I remember him. A sweet boy, so full of life. It broke my heart to see him there, abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect him." Mark leaned forward, his voice tense. "What happened to him, Sarah? Why was he sent to Ward 3? She looked away, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. Ward 3 it was a place of last resort. The children there, they didn't have families who could pay, who could fight for them. The hospital administrators wanted to keep them hidden, out of sight, so they wouldn't have to explain why they weren't receiving proper care. Mark felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice calm. So they left him there to die. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No, at least not intentionally. But there was an outbreak, a virus that spread through the ward. They didn't have the resources to quarantine them properly. And when Evan got sick, they just let him fade away. I tried to help, but they told me to stay out of it. They threatened me if I said anything." Mark's fists clenched, the horror of it sinking in. Evan hadn't died of natural causes. He had been left to wither away, discarded like so many others, his life deemed unworthy because of his family's financial situation. "I couldn't do anything for him," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I held his hand as he took his last breath, and I swore I'd never forget him." Mark reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for telling me." He left the care home with a heavy heart, the weight of Evan's story pressing down on him. He knew he had to tell Laura the truth, no matter how painful it would be. But he also knew that by uncovering this dark chapter, he was giving her the closure she deserved. As he drove back into town, he made a silent vow. Evan Hawthorne's story would not be forgotten. He would make sure that the truth was known, that justice, however delayed, would be served. And as he prepared to face Laura, he felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that he had done everything in his power to honor the memory of a boy who had been left behind. A mother's farewell. The evening air was thick with an oppressive quiet as Officer Mark Reed parked his car outside Laura Hawthorne's modest home. The sun was setting, casting a dim, orange glow over the street, as if the very sky itself mourned the truth he had uncovered. Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself for what he was about to do. He had pieced together the horrifying fragments of Evan's final days, and now he had to deliver that truth to the one person who had waited decades for answers, no matter how agonizing they might be. He could see Laura sitting on her porch, her frail figure slumped over, staring blankly into the distance. She looked older than he remembered, as if each passing day had worn her down even further. She clutched the small, faded teddy bear he'd found in the abandoned building, holding it close as though it were her only connection to her lost son. As Mark approached, she looked up, her eyes tired yet expectant. She gave him a slight nod, an acknowledgement that she had been waiting for him, that she was ready to hear whatever he had to say, no matter how painful. "Laura," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I found out what happened to Evan. It's not an easy story to hear, but I believe you deserve to know the truth." Laura's hand tightened around the teddy bear, her knuckles white as she braced herself. "Please, Officer Reed," she whispered, "tell me everything. I've waited so long. I can handle it." Mark sat down beside her on the worn steps, searching for the right words, for the gentlest way to convey the horror he had uncovered. He began by recounting the systemic neglect at Ridgeway General, the dark secret of Ward 3, and how it had been used as a hidden place to dispose of patients who couldn't afford proper care. He told her about the forgotten ward, where children were isolated, left to fend off illnesses without the resources they needed, abandoned by those who were supposed to protect them. Laura's face grew pale, her eyes widening as she listened, each word slicing through her heart like a blade. She had suspected it for so long, but hearing it spoken aloud was a confirmation of her worst fears. "And even," Mark's voice faltered, but he forced himself to continue. "They sent him to Ward 3 when he got sick. They didn't have the resources to treat him. And there was an outbreak in the ward. They isolated the children to contain it, but they didn't do enough. They just let him slip away, Laura. He was scared, and he didn't understand why he'd been abandoned." Laura's lips trembled, her eyes filling with tears as she clutched the bear even tighter. "My poor baby," she whispered, her voice choked with grief. "He was all alone. He must have been so frightened." Mark felt his own throat tighten as he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "There was someone there with him," he said gently. "A nurse named Sarah. She held his hand during his last moments. She told me he was a sweet, brave boy. He wasn't alone in the end, Laura. Someone cared for him, even if it was just for those final moments." Laura sobbed, her frail body racked with grief as the truth settled over her. All these years, she had clung to a thin thread of hope, a desperate belief that maybe, just maybe, her son was still out there. But now, that thread had snapped, leaving her adrift in a sea of sorrow. After a few moments, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I spent so many nights hearing his voice, Officer Reed. I thought I was losing my mind. But now I know he was calling out for me, waiting for me to find him. And I failed him." "No, Laura," Mark said firmly, his voice filled with empathy. "You didn't fail him. The system did. The people who were supposed to care for him failed him. You did everything you could. And now, by uncovering the truth, you've honored his memory. He can finally rest in peace, and so can you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. "Thank you, Officer Reed. Thank you for giving me closure, even if it's not the kind I wanted." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the truth settling between them. Finally, Laura took a deep, shuddering breath and rose to her feet, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I want to see him," she said softly. "I want to go back to that place, to say goodbye properly. I never got to do that." Mark nodded, understanding the importance of this moment. "I'll take you there," he said gently. "You deserve that." They drove back to the old hospital in silence, the building looming dark and foreboding in the fading light. As they stepped out of the car, Laura's gaze lingered on the building, her expression a mixture of dread and resolve. She walked slowly, as though each step required all the strength she had left. Mark guided her through the decaying hallways, past the remnants of forgotten lives, until they reached the room where he had found Evan's belongings. Laura walked inside, her gaze falling on the small bed in the corner, the empty crib, the worn-out toys scattered across the floor. She knelt beside the bed, gently placing the teddy bear on the pillow, as though offering it as a final gift to her lost son. "Evan," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm so sorry, my love. I should have been there for you. I should have fought harder. I hope you can forgive me." Mark watched, his heart aching as Laura said her final goodbye. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with decades of unspoken grief, but there was also a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that settled over them, as though the room itself acknowledged her sorrow and granted her the closure she sought. As Laura knelt there, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, Mark felt a subtle shift in the air, a warmth, a gentle presence that seemed to wrap around them. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he felt as though Even was there, watching over his mother, offering her the forgiveness she so desperately needed. After a long silence, Laura rose to her feet, her face streaked with tears, but softened by a faint, bittersweet smile. She looked at Mark, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing me here, for helping me find him. I can finally let go now." Mark nodded, his own eyes misty. He placed a comforting arm around her as they walked out of the building, leaving behind the shadows of the past. Together, they stepped into the night, the weight of grief replaced by a quiet sense of peace. In the days that followed, Mark made sure Even's story was known. He filed a report, speaking out against the systemic neglect that had taken the lives of so many like Even, the children who had been forgotten by society. His efforts led to an investigation, one that uncovered more than anyone had anticipated. The hospital's history became public knowledge, sparking outrage and sorrow across the community. Ridgeway came together to honor the lives lost, to remember those who had been left behind in the shadows. A small memorial was erected at the site of the old hospital, a simple stone with the names of each child who had passed in the forgotten ward. And at the top of the list, in bold letters, was the name Even Hawthorne. Laura visited the memorial every week, leaving fresh flowers and speaking softly to her son, as though he could hear her. She no longer heard his cries in the night, no longer felt the burden of unanswered questions. She had found her peace, and so had Even. And as for Officer Mark Reed, he carried the memory of that case with him always. It became a reminder of why he had joined the force, of the power of justice, and the importance of compassion. He knew he couldn't save everyone, couldn't rewrite the past, but he had brought closure to one family, to one mother and her lost son. And that, he realized, was enough. In his quiet moments, he would think back to the shadow he'd seen in the hospital window, the small figure he felt watching him. He no longer questioned it, no longer wondered if it was real or imagined. He simply accepted it as part of the story, part of the love that had transcended time and death. Because in the end, he knew that Even's spirit had never truly been alone. He had been waiting all these years for his mother to find him, to bring him home. And now, at last, he was free.